Tatsalach oi kaloma Wenakisa Beth Piatote in was Nimipu Kovil Knish Liloitza Tats Esh Pine. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, friends. It's so good that you're here. My name is Beth Piatote, and I'm an associate professor here at Berkeley and also the current director of the Arts Research Center. The Arts Research Center has been delighted to be a co-sponsor of this amazing visit with Jake Skeets. I'm sure many of you had the joy of being at Jake's reading that was part of Lunch Poems today. And we're here now to hear a craft talk from Jake. So just a word from our sponsors. Art needs support, and we're very happy to be co-sponsoring this event with Lunch Poems and the English department, with generous support from Engaging the Senses Foundation, from Dr. and Mrs. Tom Colby, the UC Berkeley Library, the Morrison Library Fund, the Dean's Office for the College of Letters and Science, and Poets and Writers. So thank you to all of our sponsors. And thank you to Jake Skeets for coming and spending this time with us. We're so fortunate to have Jake with us. Jake is the author of Eyes Bottled Dark with a Mouthful of Flowers, the winner of the National Poetry Series, Kate Tufts Discovery Award, the American Book Award, the Whiting Award. He's the winner of the 2018 Discovery Boston Review Poetry Prize, and his work has appeared in Boston Review, Poetry Foundation, Waxwing, Ploughshares, and elsewhere. He is currently working on a second collection of poems, a book of essays, a prose work yet to be fully defined. And we are very happy today to hear a craft talk called The Memory Field. Jake is from the Navajo Nation and is an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma. Please welcome Jake Skeets.
Thank you, Beth, for the introduction. Yad A, Sh'e Matthew Jake Skeets in Che, Sinajin the Shlan Tkobahan Bashis Chin, Tkachini Dashiche, Do Twitter Ojan Dashinor. Hello, everybody. My name is Jake, and as it was mentioned, I'm from the Navajo Nation. I'm from a small town called Vandewagen, New Mexico, and I feel like that particular hometown has a lot of influence and sort of how I think about poetry and literature and writing in general. You see, Vandewagen, New Mexico is located just south of a town called Gallup, New Mexico, which sits on the historic Route 66. And so for those who are unfamiliar with Gallup as a town, as an idea, Gallup in old Hollywood times was a site for a lot of different movies. So a lot of our old Hollywood films were filmed in Gallup or in the surrounding fields or surrounding areas. And of course, Gallup itself sits next, or sort of situated in a very unique space. It's called the Indian capital of the world for a reason. It sits and it neighbors the Navajo Nation, in addition to the Zuni Pueblo, and the Laguna Pueblo, and the Hopi Pueblo. Hence, the Indian capital of the world. So Gallup as a town also became sort of a site for what was known as Indian trading, specifically Native American artisans coming into Gallup to sell their work, and that work was then resold to tourists, right, who came to Gallup because it sat on the Route 66, who came to Gallup because of old Hollywood, right, and who came to Gallup specifically with that kind of aesthetics, looking for Native American jewelry. So today, if you visit Gallup, it's still the same idea of a town, the same idea of a place. It's still very much situated next to these Native nations. It is still very much associated with Native American jewelry and Native American art. And it still has remnants or relics of this old Hollywood. One of the central sort of buildings is the El Rancho Hotel, which a lot of different artists sort of called that home for a bit as they were filming these particular films. And if you go on to the second floor of that building, there are still there, pictures and autographs of all these different celebrities. So I feel like the town and the space where I grew up is very much part of the American lexicon when you're talking about, the idea of America, the idea of the United States, in terms of, glamour and progress, right? So it's a very interesting town, and I grew up, again, a really small town just south of that. And I grew up around a lot of different kinds of borders, a lot of different kinds of fences and divisions. So you see, in where I'm from, it's basically called the native checkerboarded area. So I grew up on the reservation land on the Navajo Nation, but just a mile north of me was public land. So there was a gas station there that sold liquor and had the ability to sell liquor. And normally that kind of sale is not prohibited on the reservation, but again, because of these divisions that exist, it was available freely. So I grew up in that kind of environment and grew up in sort of my proximity to alcoholism was very close. And as, of course, if you venture into Gallup, one of its other nicknames in addition to the Indian capital of the world was Drunktown, USA. So a lot of different contexts to where I grew up, a lot of different contexts to these towns. And so when I was writing my first book, that idea of memory, of moving into the memory of this particular place, was a big part of making meaning in my poems and guiding the form of my poems specifically. And so today I'm going to talk to you all about this idea of the memory field, which really is an interrogation and sort of a scrutiny of the way the land informs how we create poetry, or the way that we perceive the world, or sort of the way that we define a kind of personal truth. And the landscape itself is so closely associated with memory that in this particular view, memory and land are pretty much one and the same. They are very much associated with each other. And so the memory field started out as an essay that I wrote for Emergence magazine, where I was sort of openly thinking about this idea of this land memory connection. And from this particular essay, it grew into this idea, or this kind of poetics that I could present at spaces like this, right? So whenever I'm invited to talk about craft or the idea of craft, I like talking about memory and the way that memory works within writing in general. And when you layer the contexts of Native history, and specifically the history of where I'm from, memory, it makes that much more sense. So I wanted to start with this particular picture here. So the image is a little blurry, but the image depicts five Navajo children, Dept children. So the young person in the center making the funny face is actually me. So very young Jake there. To the back of me is few of my older cousins, or where I'm from, all of our cousins are also our brothers. So those are my older brothers in the back of me. And then you can see the arm of my younger brother there in the back. So I came across this picture a few years ago, and it just sort of stuck with me about how much layering is happening here. So we have, these Navajo children here, and we're sort of playing around in this what's called sort of a shade house where we are. So generally, when we had cookouts, family gatherings, it was in this particular shade house. And if you sort of way in sort of the background of the particular picture is this sort of old, kind of like, I don't want to say dump yard, but there's a lot of like cans that from like the 50s and 60s that were left there. There's like an old car that's sitting out there, very like 50s, 60s kind of style. That we actually took the hood off of the car and we used it as a sled when I was a child. Because just further beyond those trees in the background is a ditch, so we would just travel down this hood of the car into this ditch whenever it snowed. And if you take a look at our bodies and our faces, we're actually covered with a particular substance, and that's actually ash. Right near the area is also this sort of like ash mound where my aunties would, whenever they would clean out their stoves, would come out and just put it in this particular ash mound. And as children, for some reason, we decided it'd be fun to play in it. So we covered ourselves in ash. We ran around, played tag. And I remember that particular day getting in a lot of trouble because we weren't supposed to be playing in it. But I was thinking about this particular image because at this point in time, we were beginning to sort of grow older. And I didn't have a puberty ceremony that normally you do have when you sort of reach that particular age. And so I was wondering this sort of inclination or this desire to cover ourselves in this organic material, right? What about our childlike sort of desires want us to sort of cover ourselves with ash, when generally covering yourself with ash has a particular significant meaning in Diné ceremony and Diné life. So I thought of our childhood and our curiosity and our exploration of the world around us as a kind of puberty ceremony. We really learned how to become who we are because of those woods in the background, because of our journeys into this sort of ditch that exists behind our houses. And so growing up with my brothers and on the reservation and just being outside in the landscape, I feel like was actually a really necessary part of who I am as a person, because I got to explore a lot of different landscapes and really become part of the land itself. I remember one summer, because during the summers, all of our parents worked full times, right? So it was just basically us. We were our own babysitters. And so one summer we had a sort of a pact that we wouldn't wear shoes all summer. And we succeeded. We did not wear a shoe once. And I think it was just that kind of upbringing, that kind of memory that exists with me is one that I cherish really well. I cherish a lot. And I think that it ties a lot with this idea of the memory field because it's so much associated right now with landscape. So whenever I travel back to this particular area, I remember all these different things. I remember all these different events and ideas and journeys that I sort of took with my brothers back home. And so it becomes a big part of who I am. And the landscape specifically holds on to those particular memories for me. And I think it's just a really great idea, a really great concept to think about in terms of memory, or how memory is held for us in the landscape. So I want to talk today about two kinds of memory. In this defining of the memory field, what does it mean to have a kind of definition? So there are two sort of concepts of memory that I wanted to talk about. And the first is personal memory. And the second is the idea of post-memory. So personal memory, I find, is very much associated with personal truth and the idea of personal truth. And I'm actually going to borrow a little bit from creative nonfiction here as a genre. So when I read The Body of Memory by Brenda Miller, there's a lot of discussion there about memory and its relationship to the body. That whenever we delve into essays as a genre and as a project, and we remember certain things, the idea of what is true becomes slippery. Right? Because what is true to us and our experiences may not necessarily be true to other people. So Brenda Miller discusses truth as not necessarily related to fact, but as a systematic weaving and layering of experience and observation that spur a way of knowing. And I thought that's a very interesting way to define truth, because when we think about native ways of knowing or indigenous ways of knowing, those are also very much tied to memory. They're not necessarily, the representation of indigenous ways of knowing isn't necessarily scientific or related to fact or related to this idea of truth. Right? But what we know as Native people and as Native nations is that our origins, our journey narratives, our our creation stories all come from a particular kind of memory. And those memories are sustained through things like language, so prayers and songs, but they're also sustained through the landscape and taking care of the landscape and sustaining the landscape, because without landscape we don't have language, and without language we don't have a community or a people. So it's very much associated with this idea of honoring and cultivating and sustaining a particular way of knowing. So when we decide to write something down, we're committing to that particular act. Right? We want to sustain a particular idea, sustain a particular part of ourselves. And so I was thinking openly about this idea of the body of memory and the relationship to the body, and how our own bodies also hold memory, right? So Brenda Miller, in that particular essay, in that chapter, talks about the muscle memory, right? So remembering how to ride a bike, right? Remembering these particular things that we grow up with, and that being a really good place to start writing from, right? That we really already instinctively know how to express ourselves and communicate, because it's generally the first things we learn as children, right? How to communicate what we need or what we want. For me, thinking about this particular element, there's a collapse of our exterior and interior worlds, right? That we're able to sort of perceive, or we're giving ourselves the ability of perception without really so much focused on sort of the logics of time, right? We sort of break down time a little bit when we begin to remember certain things, specifically the way our body instinctively remembers things for us. And this brought me to an essay called Some Notes on Organic Form by Denise Levertov, where she talks about form as a concept and as a structure that is birthed and forged only out of what she calls a constellation of experiences. That when we live our lives, we begin to sort of form constellations of these different experiences and ideas and observations that we have, so much so that it begins to spill over, right? That we are brought to speech, as Levertov says, right? That we are moved to try and express it in some way. We can't hold it in within ourselves. So this process she calls constellation and apperception. The constellation of experiences, the apperception is the meditation and the modulating of those particular experiences into an exterior form outside of ourselves. And in my case, I'm talking about poetry, and Brenda Miller's case, talking about essays. But really, if we can ask anything that we produce, right? Whether it's stories, arts, right? The products that we make with our hands are going through this process as well. And for me, I feel like that's a way of perceiving and perception that's more organic, and one rooted in both our bodies and the landscape. So in defining personal memory, again, it's really about this systematic forging of experience and layering of experiences that help us create a way of knowing. And we tap into this way of knowing whenever we decide to produce something, right? Whenever we decide to say something or write something or share a part of ourselves with the outside world. And so now we move into post-memory. And really, the idea of post-memory, I'm borrowing really largely from Brandon Shimoda's discussion on post-memory, and of course, Marianne Hirsch's work on post-memory. But the poetics of post-memory is really, as Brandon Shimoda states, and I'll summarize, a connection to the past not by recall, but what Shimoda calls an imaginative investment, projection, and creation. And so for me, if personal memory is related to the body, if personal memory is related to the body, post-memory is related to the whole, where when we go through a process of tapping into this idea of collective memory, or this idea of our families, our familial memory or ancestral memory, right? There is a collapse, of course, of exterior-interior worlds, which really is an ability to reclaim these particular memories, right? And if we move through a process of constellation apperception with this idea of collective memory, we begin to realize a lot more truths about who we are as an entire people. And so for me, post-memory is very much associated with the memory field in that when you're writing from a marginalized group or a group that has been historically excluded from institutions, it becomes a way of reclamation, right? It becomes a way of taking things back that were stolen from you. And it also becomes a way to realize the kinds of truths that exist in your own personal way of knowing, and of course your community's way of knowing. And so post-memory as a concept and as idea, I think is really related to this sort of notion of decolonization. And I know that's a word that we hear often, and there's a lot of discourse and debate about what is decolonization, what does it look like. And I'm pretty sure every November I see things like decolonize your bookshelf, having Native authors and Native writers and purchasing them and putting them on your bookshelf. And I've always wondered, what does that look like? What does it really look like to decolonize a particular thing? But I think one of the ways that we can begin to start those particular discussions is through post-memory. Because again, it's all about reclamation and reclaiming these particular ways of knowing that are specific to Indigenous people and centering those ways of knowing. And tapping into these particular memories is the way that we can start. So if we think about knowledge in general, and I'm going to borrow here from Fillmore Bluehouse, who was a Diné medicine practitioner and poet and writer and scholar. And unfortunately, we lost Fillmore Bluehouse last year due to the pandemic. But in, I think it was 2018, at the Emerging Diné Writers Institute in Crown Point, New Mexico, that's held every year at Navajo Technical University, Fillmore Bluehouse gave a talk on what he called the 3 layers of knowledge for Navajo people. And I thought it was a very interesting talk, and he openly said that you can talk about these ideas you can share what he talks about, so that's why I'm talking about it today. Otherwise, I would have kept it secret, but Fillmore Bluehouse did give us permission to sort of share it and take with it and share it with other people. And so if we take a look at knowledge as a sort of, I don't want to say hierarchy, but as a layered thing, there are 3 levels according to Fillmore Bluehouse. So there's sort of this general basic layer, right? So the instinctive memory that we have, the instinctive knowledges we have, how do we wake up? We know how to breathe. We know how to ride a bike, right? And all those are developed. And then on top of that, or layered on top of that, is sort of this memory associated that we sort of learn with communication. How do we relate to other people? How do we sort of experience the world through these different lenses? And he sort of associated that with, going to school, learning how to have a job, right? How to have a career, and how to think for yourself, and how to do things like arithmetic, right? And he talked about that in relationship to working with people, right? Working with ideas and working with knowledge. And then the 3rd layer was what he called esoteric knowledge, or knowledge that's associated with ceremony and prayer and song. And he said a Diné person, or people in general, when they tap into this specific way of knowing, they begin to realize how much knowledge is taken for granted, right? That when we learn something, we just consider it learned and sort of move on. But when we begin to think about the origins of the things we learn, the sort of layering of who we are as people becomes that much more present. And so for me, when I talk about the memory field, I'm really talking about the kinds of knowledges that exist within ourselves, and our ability to venture and journey into those layers whenever we decide to sit down to write a poem or write an essay or express ourselves in some way. And of course, this is all instinctual at this point, right? Whenever you decide to journal or write a poem or write something down, you go through this process pretty much without thinking about it. But for me, I'm very much interested in trying to parse through this process and really understand, okay, what mechanisms are involved here? What is happening to space and time, basically? And it's a really interesting notion of thinking about this layering or this sort of spiraling of knowledge within ourselves. And it brought me back to this particular quote here. So this is Ruth Benally, and she was quoted in the book Bitterwater, The Net Oral Histories of the Navajo Hopi Land Dispute, which was edited by Malcolm Benally. And Benally had this to say: "We learned how to live by taking care of the livestock. It is like a cornfield. There are many ways to prepare corn and use the pollen. The pollen is used by healers in the Blessing Way ceremony so that we never lose the memory of a cornfield. We have a natural kinship that's woven into the land. It is how we walk on the land. That is why even when we are told no, we have to resist. We do not want to live any other way." And so for me, this knowledge that's being sustained through these memories, like the memory of a cornfield, I think is a very beautiful statement and beautiful way of providing a framework of Diné thought and Diné way of life. And I was sort of really drawn to this idea of a natural kinship woven into the land. And so it's from this particular quote and this particular idea that I came up with the notion of the memory field. And I define the memory field as radical remembering as resistance and reconciliation. And that when we sort of delve into memory field as a process, sort of space and time is negotiated through this idea of radical remembering, right? So that when we remember and we recollect and we sustain those particular events and ideas from our past, we will remember beyond the confines of time and space. And so I think that's very much akin to time travel, right? So that when we decide to remember something, we are, traveling back in time. And I think it's of course, I don't want to move into the sort of sci-fi realm, but if we think about it without the framework of colonial logic, right? Because colonial logic tells us that in order to be somewhere, our body physically needs to be there to take up space, right? So that the idea of time travel is only possible if our physical bodies are literally able to move back in time, and that's the only way that it's possible. But if we move back into Benally's and Bluehouse's ideas, right, that there's this layering and these worlds and these existences that are within us, right, I believe that this process of radical remembering is very much, associated with this idea of time travel. And the memory field also does another particular project, which I think is important, especially today, with things like the Anthropocene and climate change. And what the memory field does for me, or this radical remembering does, is that it redefines exterior worlds as a unique temporal network associated with the mind, therefore a matter of domesticity. So what I mean by that is that when we begin to label the landscape as holders of memory, we automatically mark them as part of who we are as people, right? They have a kind of personhood associated with them because they're able to remember things for us. Therefore, they become part of our domestic, of who we are. And colonialism as a process really relied on labeling exterior worlds like landscape and sort of nature as something outside of the domestic, right? So if we think of traditions like greetings, so I'm pretty sure whenever we come up with someone, we say hello, right? And if we think about the origins of the word hello, right, it's actually related to frontier, right? So that when you were on the frontier, so out in the Old West, when you would enter a house, you would say hello the house, right? To sort of tell the people living there that you were not so savages outside on the frontier. You're, you were kin, you were part of that particular world. So there was this very clear defining of who is who belongs in the home, right? And who belongs in the wild, right? And so the labeling and naming of those particular things became things like, savage, right? And wilderness, right? Things that were outside of, the home of this particular country. And so that clear definition, right, then helps colonialism, because we need to, tame this wilderness, right? We need to tame these wild people associated with the wilderness. And so it becomes a project of, again, progress, that we need to sort of tame all these particular people, begin mapping things out and navigating. But the memory field, right, claims wilderness as part of who we are as people. It claims nature as part of our interior selves. It becomes sort of associated with this idea of the mechanisms of our brain, and therefore a matter of the domestic, right? And therefore hopefully protects it. But what we know is that U.S. colonialism is very sort of unique and sort of tricky, and is able to move into spaces, even in sort of when you try to reclaim them. And so the memory field as an idea, I think, can be applied to a lot of different genres, a lot of different disciplines. But when we talk about poetry specifically, I like this idea of going back to Denise Levertov's constellations and apperception in terms of poem making. So I tried to talk about sort of charting it out, right? That when we decide to write a poem, that this is sort of the process of writing that particular poem. So we have, again, a constellation of our memories, of our experiences, of our observations, and that's what starts this utterance, or this urge to speak, right? This spark, or this emergence, right? And if we think about sort of Dept time and Dept way of knowing, almost like the morning time, right? That something happens in our lives that inspires us to write. And so that's sort of the baseline idea, right? And that's what that horizontal line means. So the horizon of poem making is the idea of constellation, is the idea of memory. And then when we move through the process of apperception, right? Again, apperception is meditation on those experiences. It's modulating our memories and our ideas, and the vibration of thinking about those particular things that develops into language or songs or rhythms or structures or colors, right, depending on what you produce. There's a kind of refraction happening, right? You sort of move away from this horizon into this sort of particular, into this another element, so this other sort of way of expressing yourself, right? And so this idea of refraction, I think I borrow from Jennifer Cheng, The Poetics of Refraction, where she talks about language being errant translation, right? That whatever we do is sort of an attempt to translate our experiences, our memories, our ideas, right? And so if we think about a process of refraction, then we can sort of consider that it should operate then similar to sunlight, right? That we have this baseline, this constellation of things, then we move through apperception and we decide to make something. We go off in all these different tangents, all these different ideas, all these different ways of knowing, all these different languages and structures and colors, right? And so there's this dispersing or this dawning, right? I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about poem making, but really anything making, right? Any product worth making is going through a process similar to this. And so the Poetics of Refraction, right, again, is really based off the quote of "all language is errant translation" by Jennifer Cheng. And this baseline normative mode of meaning is sort of refracted or interrupted to sort of forge this alternative meaning making in a lot of different products. And I wanted to sort of expand on this idea of errant translation to sort of contribute to that idea that all language is the refraction of experience, right? That when we think about the origin of language, it was always about trying to detail the world in a particular way. So if you think of early cave paintings, right? You see something and you want to, get it back out and sort of represent it back to the world. But it's only through things like colonialism and capitalism that language became this thing of measurement and definitions and really just capital, right? Trying to sell and trade and expand empire. But I like this sort of earlier notion, or this organic notion, a gesture of language, one related to refraction and sustainability. All right, and just to end on some other thoughts to think about in relationship to the memory field, I want to turn to this quote by Robert Duncan, who states, "Our consciousness in the poem as a supreme effort of consciousness comes in a dancing organization between personal and cosmic identity," right? That the poem sort of becomes this site where we can interrogate a lot of who we are as people and communities, specifically because we're interrogating language. And I want to turn to this particular excerpt from the poet Esther Boleyn, from her poem Doclige, from the collection of cartography. The poem writes, "Navajo language, where blue is green and green is blue, churning a color into living water, an ocean, or perhaps unions. Doclige, like the churning waters, doclige, like the churning waters." And so for me, the word doclige can mean both blue or green in Dene. And there's a lot of these instances in Dene where meaning and function and ideas are collapsed. And I think this is a really great place to end, because we begin to realize how much language is, just a glimpse or gesture of how we experience the world. And poetry specifically becomes a site where we can get back to those particular experiences. But yes, thank you so much for your time today. Looking forward to any questions you have in the conversation here in a bit. But thank you so much. Yeah. Should I turn this off?
No, this is a perfect background, I think. I will just ask a few questions, and then I want to open it up to this great gathering we have of writers. Thank you for this really mind-expanding talk that you just gave. I want to ask you some specific questions about your work and things that I was thinking about as you were speaking about memory of land. And one of the things I've noticed is a consistent presence of animals in your poetry, and particularly the animals of your homelands. And I wonder how you think about their presence in your work, how they appear to you, how they present. Often you have references to spines and parts and things like that. So just tell me a little bit about how those animals appear in your poems.
Yeah, I think for me, the stunning sort of, I guess I don't want to say function, because I don't think that's the right word, but the way that animals tend to show up in my poetry is really associated with this wanting of expression, right? That whenever we decide to write a poem, we want there to be this sort of resonance happen with the language, right? So if you describe something as just blue, right, there's this more transactional kind of relationship between the poet and the reader. But if you define something like, this sky is like a blue bird, right, there's a bit more resonance to that. And so for me, animals are really that thing that takes place of color, right, that takes place of texture, because that's a very universal idea, right? We all experience the world and sort of the animals that exist within it in very specific, in our own specific ways, but we all understand, what they are, how they look, how they might feel, right, how they might sound. So I think that's very much where I come from in terms of animals. And I think that's also just thanks to the lineage of Dept language and Dept people, because we have entire words just based out of animal sounds, right? So I think of the word tli, which is the word for horse, and that's really just the mimicking of the sound that horses make in their nose, right? And I just love that idea of these, people creating language long ago, seeing a horse and hearing a horse and thinking, how do I make that sound, right? How do I mimic that without a word for it, right?
Yeah, we also have a lot of onomatopoetic terms in our language too, and I've also thought about that, like, oh, when we call crow, we're trying to speak to them in their language, but that's our language too, and there's this meeting place there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Dept, it's the crow is gagi, which is their sound, right? Trying to mimic that sound.
Yeah. Oh, good. So many things to talk about. How is your writing about your homelands? How is it different when you're there compared to when you're away?
That's a good question, because I'm away right now. And when I was writing Eyes Bottled Dark and thinking about the memory field, I was away then. But I think, I guess the sad thing, I think, about wanting to write, right? Wanting to write poetry is that you're only able to really understand the resonance of a particular experience or idea or observation only after some time has passed, right? That, yes, you might see something like an image that inspires you, but the process, again, of refraction, of translation, of trying to get that onto the page takes time, and it takes distance as well. So I think for me, being away from Dept actually helps a little bit in terms of creating this distance and time so that I'm able to think more freely and meditate more freely about something I'm yearning for, right? Something I'm desiring, because I'm not there currently. But I lived on the reservation because I taught at Dept College, which is our tribal college. And so I lived there, and I think just that time, space spent back home really helped who I am and really helped me actually think more confidently, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And being back home on the res during the pandemic was also very isolating, gave us a lot of time of just being at home because we had curfews. We literally just had to be home and sort of force ourselves to just sort of be part of the landscape there.
I was wondering how other arts influence your writing. So I know a lot of writers are also influenced by visual artists or performance or music. How do you think, or what have you learned from other artists about doing art, or how do Navajo textiles or other kinds of art forms, whatever they are, influence you?
I think the easy sort of arts would be sort of like photography, right, or film, really looking at the image and how the image moves. But I really think that's just the poetics of where I went to school. Again, I went to school at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the poetics there are very much associated with image, right? So you think of poets like Sherwin Bitsui and Arthur Z, who were part of the poetics there and the development of how you teach poetry. And if you look at sort of the long lineage of alumni who graduated from IAA, people like poets like Lady Long Soldier, right, or Dichia Nanook Okpik, or Orlando White, all really image-based poets. And I like to think I'm part of that lineage of focusing on the image. And so photography and film really help with that. But in terms of Navajo textiles, I actually took a weaving class during the pandemic at Dept College. And it was all through Zoom, which is very interesting. But I remember me and my partner, during the pandemic, we set up looms in our dining table, and we were sort of just weaving and learning the process of making the loom and actually weaving. Began to realize how sort of physical that process is. And I think for me, I like to think of my poetry to be just as laborious, or is that the word, right? As just as much labor you would put into making a rug, you should be able to put into a poem, right? So that means really thinking about form and structure, and of course the way that you weave, right, certain words and phrases together. So my poems often tend to strive for surprise and have a really nice sound to them. And that takes time. It just takes a tremendous amount of work to think about words and the exact right word, right, to sort of put down next. Can take a lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. And it's just a very long process for me.
Yeah, I started thinking about when you were talking about muscle memory, because beadwork and other things, they are all this muscle memory that also tie back across generations, and so important for our way of moving through the world is to have these kind of muscle memories that connect us. But I was, speaking of laboring over a poem, how do you know when a poem is done? Is a poem ever done?
That's a good question. I think I'm probably with the poets that say a poem is never done. For Eyes Bottled Dark, my graduation date was the deadline because it was part of my thesis. So in order for me to graduate, I needed to finish the collection and get it out, and submit it to my thesis team. So that was the deadline for me, and that's generally when I stopped sort of revising and writing it. And I actually wish I had waited a little bit, because right when I graduated is when discussions for publishing happened. So there was not much time between me graduating and me getting the book out. And I wish that there actually was a bit more time there so that this time and distance could build a little bit so that I can go back and revise with a clearer sort of vision. Not to say I'm not proud of Eyes Bottled Dark or proud of it.
In the list of awards that.
But I feel like I could have not to sort of toot my own horn, but I feel like I could have written an even better book, had I had a little bit more time.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Yeah. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to our audience. So. Twyla is here with a mic to go around talk show style, so you can get ready, and I'm going to ask you one more question about the DNA of other writers appearing in your poems. Can you know what, I'm lying, I have another question, so you have like one more second too. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. I come from IA and that particular school of poetics, and I don't think that there's been a lot of talk yet about the kind of poetries that are coming out of Santa Fe, specifically IA, and I think there needs to be more discussion and more sort of, I don't want to say classification, but there is a big movement happening there around image, and I feel like my poetry is definitely a part, or at least trying to speak to that particular school as a site for poem making. So for sure, like Lady Long Soldier, Orlando White, are big parts of the DNA of my book. I also think Sherwin Bitsui, another Dept poet, was a big part of the revision. Sherwin and I really went through very closely through the entire book, very page by page, even punctuation by punctuation, to really interrogate each sort of choice I made and make sure that was the right choice. And of course, my other mentors, Joan Navayuk-Kane and Santi Frazier, best readers on the planet. If you ever have a chance of taking a class with them, or just being associated with them or networking in some way, they're great readers of my work. I remember getting back pages and pages of comments and feedback from both of those particular poets. So I think, yeah, definitely very I heavy, so I'm very, very biased. But of course, just other poets like D.A. Powell, I mentioned earlier in the reading, was a big part of the book itself. That line, again, about beauty really shaped the entire thing. And so that's why I sort of end with that particular poem.
Yeah, I think it's so fascinating to drop in a line from another poet, and then that becomes part of this other poem and just out proliferating. Okay, so my last question is about language, about using Dept in your poetry. And so I'm wondering, how does language come through you? Do you ever write something entirely in Dept and then translate it into English? Do you do just certain words present themselves in either English or Diné? Or what are different ways that your language has appeared, and what kinds of decisions do you make around translation?
Translation is definitely a very tricky process for me because I don't speak Diné fluently. And so I find that Diné as a language is actually very, like, I want to say layered, but there's actually very sort of different ways that you can talk or write Diné. And so for me, I feel like I'm very, what would be akin to like elementary level, right? And so when I was thinking about, okay, well, if I want to start writing poetry in Navajo, how do I write a poem in English and then translate it into Navajo? And I find that I have to really begin breaking down all these different sort of outside things that we put onto English, right? So for example, how do I say, a particular thing in English? And I would ask my partner this all the time, like, how do I say this in Navajo? And he would say, there's no translation because it's too complex. And because I was thinking about the word specifically stanza, right? How would I say stanza in Navajo? And if we think about the origin of the word stanza, right, it means room. We all understand that. So I asked my partner that, and he said, well, what room, right? What room are you talking about? Are you talking about like a living room? Are you talking about a bedroom where you sleep? Are you talking about a room where you eat, right? Where is the room in relationship to time and space? Mm-hmm. So I found that English actually removes all of that, right? When we just say room, we don't have that specificity. And so I have to find that I have to be very particular about writing in English first and then translating that into Navajo. So I've just stuck with the single words because I feel like the single word as a whole is enough in a poem in themselves. Because
Exactly.
Because the process of translating them is just a beautiful process.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, it's on you now. Yes, Wendy.
Hi, thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. So I hung out with Meredell Lasser and then just did a review of Kimmerer's book, this Braiding Sweetgrass. And both of those people, Meredell wandered the rivers with First Nations people, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, when she was a child in 1900 to 1912. And Kimmerer talks about Potawatomi being a verbal language rather than a noun-based language. And when Meredell talked about it 40 years ago, I just kind of thought, oh, yeah. And now going back and reading Kimmerer's book, which is so immersed in nature and place and landscape and the movement of language about how, like Lake Superior, when you say that, you're talking about where it is and how it moves and who did what there and what creation story surrounds it. And there's so much happening in the language. And I just wanted to ask you about Diné in that way and where we can go from here, because I'm leaning on storytelling and song and different things with language, and I'm just wanting to know where you mix all of that up together.
That's a good question. I think linguistically, and I can only talk from my perspective because I don't study Diné, and you can get at the University of New Mexico, I believe you can get a whole degree in Navajo. So it's that sort of intense, right? It's that, but there's so much room.
I think it has to do with people's way of being.
Yeah, and so I think in terms of Diné, yes, it's linguistically categorized as a verb-based language as well. But I think it's also a beyond language, right? Because the way that we understand language today is mostly transactional, right? The way that we understand English is mostly transactional. Yeah, so it's just, how do I express this so that I can get a response? How do we move the world forward in terms of progress? And we generally use English. But Dene, I think, is more associated with poetry, right? That there's this depth to it. It's not transactional, right? Just like I said, if you want to just say room, you can't just say there's a room there. You have to be very specific, very descriptive. You have to situate the language in time and space, right? And I feel like that's much more than just how we understand language today, right? So it's definitely something that's beyond language a little bit, and that that it is indeed a systematic way of knowing, right? It's not just language. It's song, it's story, it's landscape, and its relationship, all tied into this thing that we could call a language. But I feel like even just the word language doesn't fully entail what Dene is.
Do you have some more questions?
Hello. I just wanted to ask, I could definitely see how like metaphor, story, and poetry has like more veracity than just straight saying something or like a factual way of talking, right? And I personally have a difficulty like expressing abstract ideas like emotions or my cultural lens and stuff like that. And what are some of the tools that you use to kind of like translate these ideas into something that we can understand?
That's a good question. And I think that the major tools would just be the different kinds of devices that exist in things like storytelling. So not just poetry, but in all art making, right? So you think of image, you think of form, and of course figurative language like sensory details, right? And I believe it was in Brenda Miller's The Body of Memory where she talks about this idea of universality, right? That when we want to have a universal audience, it actually is more helpful to write with specificity, right? That yes, when we want to talk about these abstract ideas, we can funnel them through these very specific images of our lives, right? So if I wanted to talk about, okay, well, I want to talk about boarding school, I could write a story about, my aunts, right? And one that's very specific with my aunts, because all my aunts have specific kinds of scars on their arm from the vaccination shots that they would get at these boarding schools, right? And I remember once talking to one of my aunts, and sort of asking her to tell me the story about this. And so having that specific detail and image of that moment could help illuminate this sort of long abstract history of boarding schools, right? So I think, yeah, the devices that we have in art making are enough, right? to sort of get us to this next level that's beyond language, right? And again, I don't think there's a hierarchy, right? That saying something abstractly or saying something straightforward, one's not better than the other, right? It's just that one has a specific kind of resonance with it, right? And one is a bit more transactional, and having them both exist is fine, right? I think it's a sort of coloniality or remnants of colonial logic where there can only be one way of looking at the world or expressing the world, right? One has to be better than the other, when really they can all exist at the same time. There's room for all kinds of ways of expression, right?
I really liked your idea of all language and all like versions of expression being refractions of experience. And I was wondering, as like a professor and a person who holds space, when people have had like a similar experience, or when people are reflecting on experience, how do you get across this idea of giving people like the space and ideas that they can use their own voices or different ways of expressing the refraction of that singular experience?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. And again, I think for me, it's been about really looking at workshop as a process, and this is specifically through the writing workshop. What does that look like, especially when we're interested in this idea of refraction? Because if that's the case, right, the workshop model as is doesn't necessarily work anymore, right? Which I think is fine. I think that there can be definitely alternative forms of workshop that exist. And so for me, I try to move into workshops, specifically a poetry workshop, without using a lot of the different definitions and rules that exist today, right? So for example, you know, a lot of the rules that I heard when I was learning poetry were like, oh, you can't use sentimentality, right? You can't use larger words. You know, you can't you can't use like adverbs, right? You can't all these different kinds of you can't things that you can't do. But for me, with my students, I always try to be as open as possible. That yes, try. You know, these are your first drafts, right? These are all just drafts. So compose it as you want, right? And the goal of the workshop would be take the poem as it is right now, not what it could be or can be or should be, right? We're going to take it right now, and we'll sort of work with it what it is in front of us. So I think that's one way I think I've been able to sort of meet students halfway a bit in terms of honoring their experiences and where they come from.
Do you give them writing prompts?
Yeah, I have a lot of writing prompts, very wide-ranging prompts.
I just want to say thank you for coming here and speaking. I really value this opportunity. My question had to do a little bit about the idea of poems as a preservation of time, like a refraction of experience or something like that. I think what I related that with is the idea of nostalgia. It requires distance or space to be able to adequately portray a vision or an experience of something you've had. Would you say that's how does poetry provide that element of an image of an experience, and how does that come alive with the reader? Would you say that the reader is necessary in the creation of the poem as a whole that is tangible?
That's a good question. And to answer the last part first, no, I don't think a reader needs to be present, right? And I always try to sort of make this point to my students that poetry can take a lot of different forms, right? There's not just one kind of poetry. The poetry can exist in a lot of different ways. But when we're sitting in a classroom, like an academic classroom, then we're sort of following the veins of academic poetry or poetry that existed in that space. So it does come with certain guidelines. So the reader then becomes a part of that particular process, right? But that's not to say that the poetry you write at home for yourself isn't just as good as this particular poetry that we're learning here, right? And so the kind of poetry that we then learn in the classroom, right, I feel like it's able to have these kind of resonances because of the scrutiny or the interrogation of language that happens, right? And that's only possible because of distance and time, right? The book, it's my book, Eyes Bottled Dark, was again written in about 2017, 2016, and for me, I feel like that's a snapshot of who I was then. So I'm able to sort of have this sort of relationship with a former version of myself. And I think it's a really interesting thing that you mentioned that poetry being preservation of time, and I think it is. I don't necessarily think there's a timelessness to it, right? I just think that it holds time in a specific way for us as poets and as readers. Because we understand, we always say that we don't understand poetry, but we actually do understand poetry because poetry is often our first language, right? We learn how to write and talk and read through poetry. We think of nursery rhymes and children's books, right? That's poetry, and we encounter the world of language through it first. Because that, I feel like as infants and as children, it's often how we experience the world, all these firsts for the first time, right? And so getting to that kind of exploration and wonder and curiosity does take a tremendous amount of interrogation. And poetry lifts sort of the expectation and assumptions that we have about language, and we're able to then sort of just focus in and really break rules and bend rules, right? Because again, literally you can put any word down, right? Anything. You can start a poem and then you have an infinite amount of decisions to make about what word goes next, right? So that amount of interrogation helps bring us these very resonant things, right? These beautiful explorations that the poet sort of presents to us.
we have time for one more question. Noah?
Jake, thank you for being here. My question is about beauty. Your work sees history refracted in a million different forms, often very violent histories. These are woven into the landscape. They're implicit in your verbs. They're, history and its toll is everywhere. Your poems are also, brazen, or forthrightly invested in the beautiful, as themselves as beautiful objects, and the conversion or the kind of, use of language to change nouns, to change how things are experienced. What can beauty do in the context of history?
That's a great question. I think beauty provides us with a sense of balance, right? That yes, there are a lot of violent sort of things that I talk about in the book, but to balance that all out are sort of these descriptions that tend toward the beauty, right? And for Dept and Dept way of knowing, right? When we say beauty, we don't mean like perfection or things that are, utopian, right? That's not the definition we have for beauty. The beauty within Dept, I think, is mostly associated with balance, that there is a wholeness and openness to all things existing at once, right? And there's no hierarchy about which is more important. And there's no transactional sort of relationship or assumption to those particular things. Whereas in English and sort of this colonial logic, there's always transaction, right? There's always capital. There's always trying to best something, right? Dominate the field, right? There's always trying to have a one-up on something else. And I think that tends for a lot more violence than not. And so in Dept language and Dept way of thought, there's this sort of element of balance that, yes, there are all these things, but there's all these other beautiful things that exist alongside it, right? And the beauty is being able to observe and honor those particular things as much as you can. Right?
That's such a beautiful place to end. And yet, I do want to ask you if you'll send us off with a prompt. Can I be that brazen? You guys gave me the microphone, so I'm just taking advantage.
Yeah, I can definitely start it off with leave you all with a prompt. So one of the prompts I provide to my students, and this was definitely pre-pandemic, but you can definitely do this outside, is for about 20, 30 minutes, just sit outside in a very sort of a place where there's people and listen to how people talk. So basically eavesdrop on other people. Sort of study how they say particular phrasings or the kind of emotions or excitement that exists in their voices. And sort of just begin making a list of things that you might hear, different emotions, different things, even different phrasings that you might hear in, that out in the world. And then write a poem where each line represents or tries to capture each of those particular things that you see, right? So if you hear someone, who's mad in the phone, right, who's talking mad, try to write a line where there's sort of this anger or this sort of like frustration in the line. If you see two friends talking and they're laughing, right, maybe have a line that's more airy and it feels more light and balanced and there's sort of this happiness or joy associated with it, right? And really sort of study how people use like subject, verb, and noun and try to mess with that syntax in your lines as well. Try to get more closely associated with speech rather than written language and see what happens.
Amazing. Thank you for everything. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here.